It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to the Miller Center's American Forum. 50 years ago, an unexpected president, Lyndon B. Johnson, used every wrench in the legislative toolbox, along with his Democratic allies in Congress, to overcome immense conservative opposition and pass first the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, and soon after, an array of social legislation aimed at combating poverty, prejudice, poor schools, the lack of health care for millions of elderly Americans. Johnson envisioned this agenda as the means to finally fulfill the American promise of a broadly inclusive and authentic great society. Those legislative achievements were most remarkable in how President Johnson overcame the deeply divided politics of the era and a gridlocked and dysfunctional Congress to dramatically alter American society. That agenda would also set the stage for a political struggle that has raged ever since over the appropriate size and scope of the federal government. Our guest today is the author of a new book chronicling that historic political narrative, which also observes some of the striking parallels between the legislative morass of that time and the bitter quagmire in Washington, D.C. today. The book is The Fierce Urgency of Now: Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Our guest is the author, Julian Zelizer. He is the quintessential public intellectual, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and the author of many other scholarly works. He contributes a weekly column to CNN.com discussing political history and contemporary politics, and he has published in recent years hundreds of op-ed articles. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start a little bit in the present, but with a comparison to the past, and then go back into the time of Lyndon Johnson. But a few years ago, we had a president elected, Barack Obama, under circumstances that have some striking parallels to this period of President Johnson. He comes into office after a landslide election in 2008 with what appears to be a fairly broad mandate for key elements of his agenda. He then faces very dramatic conservative opposition around a key part of his agenda, but then uses every trick and tool and maneuvering strategy in Congress with his allies to push this thing through, and has what for him was a great victory in the Affordable Care Act. Unlike the time of Johnson, though, and his passage of the first of those great legislative accomplishments, Obama's victory around the Affordable Care Act did not open the playing field in any meaningful way. He's had essentially no significant legislative accomplishment since then. So why is it that these two presidents in these eras that seem similar in certain ways, but history has turned out so differently?
Well, there's many reasons. It is important to remember when Lyndon Johnson became president, he faced a Congress that was called dysfunctional. He faced a Congress that was called gridlocked. He faced a Congress that one liberal from Pennsylvania, Joe Clark, called the sapless branch of government. Back then, it was a coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans who basically blocked progress on everything that was liberal, from Medicare to civil rights. And there is a window that lasts longer than what President Obama will have. Two things that were quite important that President Obama did not have, in addition to the circumstances under which Johnson became president, was a civil rights movement which was broad in scope, which was conducting demonstrations all around the country, which was organized not just at the grassroots level, but all the way into Washington. And it was a kind of movement which President Obama, even with his election, didn't enjoy. And then the election of 1964 is different than what President Obama had in 2008. That's when Johnson's reelected. But the result of that election were huge liberal majorities in Congress, 295 Democrats in the House, 68 Democrats in the Senate, with liberals having the balance of power, and a discredited Republican Party where Barry Goldwater, who lost to Johnson, had basically made conservatism look like the one thing you didn't want to be.
It's interesting, though, that, like you say, a discredited Republican Party at that point because of Goldwater's campaign. After the 1964 election, Republicans really did say, wow, we had a stunning defeat here, and in fact may need to behave somewhat differently or look at things in different ways. In more present times, there doesn't seem to be that same sustained impact of a great electoral loss.
Part of it was that Goldwater in 1964 made that election not just about himself or not just about the GOP, but about the idea of conservatism. And he argued that the Republicans could move to the right, that really attacking key fundamental programs that were being proposed or that existed was a good thing to do. So there was a perception that it was discredited. But the other important thing is Republicans were a minority in Congress. So what you often see in contemporary times is congressional Republicans have a very different agenda than the presidential candidates because they have control. They have a very good place on Capitol Hill. Back then, the Republicans didn't. So they saw the two as intertwined.
And also that Obama, while he controls both houses, the Democrats controlled both houses in Congress after the 2008 election, it wasn't anything like the scale of control that, as you were just pointing out, that Johnson had.
It's much narrower majorities. The perception was it was more fleeting. It's important to note when he had the majorities, things happened. He had several major pieces of legislation, Dodd-Frank, ACA, an economic stimulus bill all passed. So it is a good lesson, Obama's early years, of the power that favorable Democratic majorities can have, or favorable majorities for either party can have on a president.
It's also interesting when we talk about both the frustrations of the present and the realities of this period of time, that in the present, there's a lot of talk about how good bipartisanship is, and that almost in and of itself, that anything that has a bipartisan aspect to it, that by definition means it's a better thing, a more noble thing. But the bipartisanship that was happening in the early 1960s was actually very much so on the side of the worst things that were happening in American politics.
That's an important point. Since the late 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt, after he had been reelected, there's this coalition, a bipartisan coalition, Southern Democrats who chaired most of the big committees in Congress, and Midwestern Republicans, and they teamed up in committee, they teamed up on the floor, and they had the numbers to block most liberal legislation. And this was legislation many Americans saw as quite urgent by the 1950s and 60s, like ending segregation. But they had immense power. Even as Northern liberals came into Congress, they couldn't break the stranglehold of this bipartisan coalition. So back then, if you were a liberal, the thing you wanted was more partisanship. And you wanted to end bipartisan backroom deals, which constantly blocked progress on everything.
People will often say that one of the problems we have is the two-party system. There ought to be a third party. Then historians will point out, well, actually, there always has been a third party, that Southern Democrats versus Northern Democrats were really two different parties. But in a sense, there were really four parties, that the Republicans were two different parties too. These not as conservative in some respects, not on social issues, not as racist as the Democrats in the South were. Nonetheless, this alliance between Midwestern Republicans who were very different from Nelson Rockefeller and the liberal Republicans. But so, is that fair? Was it a four-party system then?
That is fair, although within the GOP, the liberal Republicans I don't think were quite as powerful as we sometimes remember. There were the Jacob Javitzes, Nelson Rockefellers, who were very liberal on issues like race, more liberal than most Democrats. But the weight of power still was in the Midwest. So one of the key figures in my book is Senator Everett Dirksen, who was the Senate Minority Leader from Illinois. He was very conservative on most government programs. He was against unions. He was against federal regulations. This is a senator who is known as the Wizard of Ooze because of his long-winded speeches on the floor. But he was the center of power.
But in more recent years, there's been a bigger effort by particularly very conservative Republicans to court with some sincerity African-American voters, African-American conservatives. And so there's been a revival of the language of the party of Lincoln and this statistical argument that comes up often of that a higher proportion of Republicans in Congress voted for the Civil Rights Act in '64 than the proportion of Democrats. It's deceptive because of these divisions that we're talking about. But in reality, does that also obscure that it's not that the Southern Democrats became the Republican Party, it's that this alliance of hyper-conservative and somewhat racist Republicans in the Midwest who were already allied with these white supremacists in the South who were Democrats, that they ended up in a natural, not just alliance, but actually taking over the Republican Party.
Well, they do, although some of these Republicans, including Dirksen, do become the crafters of Civil Rights Act of 1964, of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Even though they were conservative and had allied with these Southerners who were very much against these issues, they change. And so they do bear some credit for this legislation. They were quite important. The Southern filibuster against the Civil Rights Act in '64 would not have ended unless Everett Dirksen, a Republican, brought about 20 Republicans over to the side of ending the filibuster. What's important, though, is they didn't just change on their own. It wasn't simply this eureka moment that they had. They were feeling the pressure, like all other Americans, like all other politicians, from the civil rights movement, which was mobilizing all over the country and making civil rights an idea whose time had come. So the credit really isn't partisan. The credit, I think, really lays with the movement and the parties gradually reacting to what the movement was doing.
And so why was it that those Republicans, like Dirksen, who become so critical of the passage of the act, why were they not immediately supportive of it?
They didn't like federal regulations, and they were always scared about expanding the power of the federal government. With the Civil Rights Act, Dirksen is particularly worried that the government will get too much power over employment decisions in businesses. Part of the legislation originally was much stronger in dealing with discrimination in employment. That Dirksen didn't like. That fit not into an argument about race, but an argument about government-business relations. So in the end, he negotiates that to be much weaker in the final legislation than in the original proposal. Religious leaders are very important in mobilizing Republican support. So civil rights advocates realize that African American protests will only go so far in a state like Illinois or a state like Wisconsin because of the demographics. So they mobilize preachers, and preachers meet with Republicans on Capitol Hill and tell them this has to end. Religious associations coordinate with local preachers in the Midwest to deliver sermons every week saying, let the Civil Rights Bill come up for a vote. Write your congressman after services are over. And Hubert Humphrey, who was then vice president, who shepherded this bill through the Senate, said that religious leaders were really the secret to why this legislation finally went through.
Interesting. And so that was also at a time when people who were elected to go to Washington and go to the White House actually still went to church.
Well, you know, Johnson is this president who takes over in the most horrible of circumstances. He takes over probably the lowest point in his career. Being vice president was about the worst experience he ever had. He was someone who liked to do things, and he didn't do much as vice president, and the Kennedys made sure of that. So he's someone who takes over, and I say early in the book, he has a very ambitious vision of what he wants to do. He wants to complete a second New Deal. This is when he came into Washington, and he wants to go even further. Johnson's a brilliant politician. He's been in Congress for so long. He has great relationships with people like Everett Dirksen. He understands the procedures, but most important, he understands the limits of presidential power. So he's determined right away to do as much as he can, because as he always told his advisors, Congress always gets the best of every president, and it was going to get the best of him. So he moves fast and furiously, but he understands how important this movement is going to be to his success. And that's in some ways what's most unusual about him at that moment.
But what does that translate into?
Well, he's often meeting with Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, plotting out strategy, urging them to go back to the states and to build pressure on members of Congress. And when the windows open because of what the movement does, Johnson doesn't hesitate. He moves forward with the bill. He pushes aggressively. He uses every tool in his toolbox to try to get the legislation through.
And there's a lot of commentary now about that this was the kind of president who knew how to move things through Congress by understanding the rules, by a particular way of interacting with the people when he was trying to convince them to go his way. But was that the singular brilliance of this one particular legislative genius? How much of that was a factor in this?
It's important, but the point of the book is that's not enough to understand why this transformative moment happened. We now have created a myth of Lyndon Johnson after decades when he was basically blasted as one of the worst presidents ever because of Vietnam, where he is now seen as this magician, a wizard of Washington who knew how to do what no one else can do. The iconic image is of the treatment, where Lyndon Johnson, 6'4", would literally hover over someone attempting to get the vote he wanted. But that is not enough. What really mattered was the condition of Congress. Early on, other than civil rights and the war on poverty, which is still a pretty small program when he first introduces it, much of his agenda is totally stifled as well in 1964. Johnson's desperate to get Medicare through Congress, but there's someone named Wilbur Mills, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, a Southern Democrat, who says no, even after Kennedy's death, even after a lot of change of public opinion that became supportive of this bill, Mills wouldn't allow it up for a vote. It's really not until the election of '64, not Johnson's arm twisting, that we get a bill like Medicare. So it's important, and I don't mean to dismiss it, but it's not enough to understand what happened and why so much happened in that period.
This whole description of the treatment, which is the sort of thing that political journalists, people like me, love to zero in on in the moment when you're covering things that are happening. You see a scene like, and the American people like these scenes. They like the idea of here's this picture or this moving footage of a president interacting with someone else, and it means some specific thing, or President Obama having a beer with the cop from Boston or from Cambridge. We like those sorts of moments, and we like to imagine some big importance to them. But the treatment, his intimidating posture toward people, always struck me as completely absurd, that was a significant part of the explanation of why there was success at the time. The idea that sort of personal, physical intimidation of members of Congress really translated into a significant change of votes always struck me as a completely theatrical proposition.
Well, one of the parts of the book that kind of challenges that is the years between 1966, where you have midterm elections where this conservative coalition regains its power, and 1968, the final 2 years of his presidency. Johnson's doing all of that. He's still leaning on people. He's still, using every mechanism of intimidation to try to get votes on bills like open housing, but it's not working. His legislation is much thinner in those final 2 years. Much of the legislation he gets is not what he originally wanted. It's really watered down, and he's a frustrated president. Part of that is Vietnam just swamping everything else. Part of it is once Congress changed, he couldn't really use all those skills of his to great effect. And there's one conversation where his advisor in 1967 is telling President Johnson, can't you do more in Congress? Can't you get some of these bills through? You're the master of the Senate. That's what everyone says. And Johnson, you could hear his anger bubbling up on the phone. He says, master of the Senate, I'm not the master of a damn thing. I can't get this Congress to pass a single thing that it doesn't want to do. So Johnson understood that some of the hyperbole about what he could do was exaggerated and sometimes dangerous, because he felt that people expected too much of him and had too much of an eye on the White House and not enough of an eye on Capitol Hill.
But the sorts of things that he could do and that did have a real effect, along you chronicle a lot of it here, are things that we oftentimes today say are really bad, or the signs of the worst kinds of politics, like pork barrel politics and giving people things that they can then trumpet that they brought home to their home districts in return for votes and other things. That actually was a big part of the effectiveness of the strategy.
Sure, it's true. And so kind of once all the pieces were in place for a bill to pass, Johnson used a lot of that, as did the Senate Majority Leader and the House Speaker of the House. They used these tools. So during the Senate filibuster, Johnson famously promises support for a water project in Arizona to get a vote to end the filibuster. He would call on unions to intimidate Republicans in Pennsylvania, reminding them they just got legislation for something else, so they better support him on the filibuster. Things which today we would consider ugly, sometimes corrupt, back then were part of the process through which legislation moved. Again, that was not the reason civil rights passed. The movement was the reason it passed, but they were important to ensuring that the legislation didn't get stifled at any moment.
In that period that the Congress operated under such elaborate rules, and I want you to explain a little bit about why it was that a Wilbur Mills could single-handedly stop something as important as what would ultimately become Medicare, or why James Eastland, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, could stop every civil rights bill for 20 or 30 years, effectively.
The rules of Congress, both the formal rules and the informal customs of Congress, at that time empowered the committee chairs. So the Speaker of the House was important, the Senate Majority Leader was important, but real power rested on the committee chairman. The committee chair could basically decide what issues would come up for a vote, what wouldn't. If a committee chair back then said, I will not support legislation, that legislation was pretty much dead. It would take an unusual mobilization to stop that. So James Eastland, who chairs a Senate subcommittee on civil rights, joked that he had pockets put into his pants just so he could bury all the civil rights bills that he wouldn't let up for a vote.
As time goes by and we all become a little less familiar with who these characters were and what they were about, particularly college-age students and young adults today, who've never heard any of these names for the most part, unless they're majoring in history. But in a book like this, you describe people as white supremacists or segregationists. But is it actually, are we understating in the normal way that we write about these times the views of these individuals? We say white supremacists, people don't even, I'm not sure everyone even quite knows what that means anymore, but a figure like James Eastland, his views weren't, he wasn't just a really prejudiced guy. He bordered on the edge of Nazi ideology, flirted with those kinds of extreme right-wing organizations.
Well, I think sometimes it's hard to remember what the political and social system was that they were protecting. So certainly if you learn about civil rights and race relations, you get a sense of what it meant for someone to oppose the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It wasn't like, well, I'm for government or against government. I'm not so liberal on race relations. You were protecting a system, a racially segregated system that was just brutal on African Americans. And I do think sometimes we forget that's the case. We do it on other policies. So in contemporary times, we talk about all the opposition that existed to President Obama's health care proposal and how it was attacked by the Tea Party. And we forget that opponents of Medicare used to call the proposal socialized medicine. The AMA mobilized opposition that was fierce against the idea that elderly people should have access to hospital insurance, which today seems basic. But back then, doctors were literally receiving pamphlets from the American Medical Association that they handed out to patients so that when a patient left their doctor's visit, they read, if Medicare passes next time you come, a bureaucrat's basically going to take care of your health care. Ronald Reagan records a record that conservatives listened to in the early 60s that says, health care sounds great. Who's opposed to health care for the elderly? But if this passes, this is the first opening step to socialism in America. So it's both the severity of the opposition we forget, and certainly with race relations, I think often we don't understand exactly what was at stake in 1964 and 65, and often downplay the significance of the legislation that passes in that period, because once you understand what was being fought, you see what a landmark those bills were.
We forget that this coalition of conservative Democrats and conservative Republicans, but that had also included at a certain critical point, not just conservative Democrats, but all sorts of Democrats. FDR, and with the New Deal, enters into these deals with all of these white supremacist figures who could have obstructed the bills the New Deal bills in that period of time. And they cut these arrangements that say, yes, the New Deal can move forward, but African Americans have to be excluded from it in every way possible. Segregation can't be tampered with as a result of this legislation. So some of what we think of as the greatest, or at least most important, depending on your most consequential legislative actions in the 20th century, are ones that still, even when proposed by someone like FDR, had baked into them preservation of this system of segregation.
Yeah, and that's once you put Congress into our stories of American history, you understand why that was the case. Too often, the history of the United States focuses on the president, and it focuses exclusively on the president. So you don't understand fully what the Congress was that president faced. In the 30s, you see this story unfold. This is when this coalition takes form. FDR was always very careful that most of the biggest federal programs, when it came to southern states, there was local and state control built in just for the purposes you said. And that's part of what's happening in the mid-1960s. That deal with the Southerners is starting to come undone. That deal is being tested by the White House, but just as importantly, by liberal Democrats like a guy named Richard Bolling from Missouri, who had been entering into Congress in the 40s and 50s and no longer wanted to live with that. Hubert Humphrey, when he runs for the Senate in 1948, this is when he comes onto the national scene, he gives a speech at the Philadelphia Democratic convention that year. And he makes a really bold speech where he says, for those of you who believe in states' rights, and I'm paraphrasing, the time has come to embrace human rights and civil rights, and if you don't agree, leave. And some Southerners take him up on that. Strom Thurmond will run as a third-party candidate. But this was exactly the deal that liberals, whose numbers grew on Capitol Hill in the 50s, wanted to challenge, wanted to fight, and were no longer willing to deal with. And for a short window, between 1964 and 1966, they have their day. And the result is the Great Society. It'll be short. Those conservatives were entrenched, and they come back very quickly, but they have their moment.
The mechanisms that in the end had some effect over the process here and that gave a president and his congressional allies some sort of a degree of leverage to try to slowly build these coalitions that were necessary, but they were things like a form of bipartisanship that actually was bad. It was necessary to undo the bipartisanship that was happening then. It was pork barrel politics, giving things to people that's supposed to be bad today. It was abuse of the rules, but these intransigent rules which we also today, if you are on the Democratic side of the equation, you think that what's happening right now, where Republicans in Congress have tried to hold up legislation to extract from the president a concession on a somewhat unrelated thing, that being immigration. If you're a Democrat, you think that's a terrible abuse of the rules. If you're a Republican, you think that President Obama and Nancy Pelosi terribly abused the rules by the mechanisms by which they pushed through the Affordable Care Act. And so we generally think the rules are bad and that leveraging these rules to advantage is really bad. And yet those were these key ingredients of how good things were done in the past. Do we have it all wrong about the way Congress should work now?
Well, I do think those rules can be used effectively. They could be abused, and they were then, they were today. When the Affordable Care Act passes, Democrats use something called the reconciliation process, which is one of these rules that most Americans, their eyes glaze when they hear this. But it's a rule that came from the 1970s, which is if you attach something to a budget bill, it can't be filibustered. And the Democrats, when Obama was elected, decided to strong-arm that piece of legislation. And so that's an example of where some of this still takes place. Republicans have been very effective under Obama at using the rules for, in their mind, very legitimate goals to totally obstruct and block up. So it still happens. I do think an important difference is all of this is exposed. This is an era where a lot of these debates, a lot of these strategies took place behind closed doors. Whereas today, there is no more space like that in American politics.
One of the strengths of your book, I think, is the argument you made just a few minutes ago and the observation you made, and that is that to push against the notion that in the mid-1960s to the end of the 60s that this kind of opportune chapter in human history opened and suddenly there was a liberal thinking or progressive thinking, whichever term one wants to use, that suddenly made it easy for these things to go through. And you very authoritatively show that that really wasn't the case, that these mechanical things were so important. But it also gets at this sort of confusion I sometimes have about the impulse toward coming up with sort of causal narratives to explain history. And oftentimes it's that whether there was this moment, and there was sort of a moment in terms of the movement, there was a change in American thinking in a big, broad way. There were changes in the Congress. But the really big thing that happened was that John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. That by itself. And all through history we have these moments where George Bush happens to have just arrived in office when 9/11 happens and suddenly has powers that he could not possibly have imagined under other circumstances. Barack Obama comes into office and suddenly is faced with an economic catastrophe not of his own making, which arguably is the real reason that has crippled so much of his legislative agenda over the ensuing 8 years. But how do you reconcile the impulse for a fancy theory versus the possibility that the dinosaurs just died because an asteroid hit the Earth?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, historians tend to talk about many factors behind anything. So we're notoriously gray when explaining anything, as opposed to being black and white like many social scientists are. I do think with the Kennedy example, that's a case where something happens and, it's a horror that happens. There's no great explanation and it changes politics. But it is possible to overemphasize how important that was to all the legislation that passes. You know, other than the Civil Rights Bill, which is not because Kennedy died. Again, that's what the movement was doing. A lot of the legislation remained stifled in 1964, not only Medicare, but education, programs that were directly related to Kennedy. And when Americans heard, let's fulfill Kennedy's agenda, those were the bills they were thinking of. They didn't go anywhere until after the '64 election. So it takes much more than the memory of a deceased president. What is interesting is it elevates a person who was going to take advantage of the moment, a person with deep roots in Congress who understood how to use a window like this when it emerged. And you can also argue it put into place someone who was going to take the wrong steps with Vietnam. And many people would say another president might have handled this differently. He might not have had the same political fears that Johnson always had of being weak on defense. And that quick moment had this huge effect on our foreign policy. So those are important, but structure does matter. And I think it's important to telling stories accurately. Otherwise, we have kind of false impressions of how politics works. So if we just focus on the person, if we just focus on these elections or dramatic moments, we're always frustrated. That's why we always say every president, everything's going to change. Because if you focus on the person, it does change every 4 to 8 years. But if you focus on the structure, how does Washington work? How does Congress work? You could pretty much predict the honeymoon's going to be short, and the problems that the previous president had are going to be similar problems that the new president has.
Let's talk about the Great Society itself. Your books are very nicely reviewed, but where there has been any kind of pushback on it, it has tended to be from conservatives, conservative writers, essentially contesting what they describe as what appears to be your position that the Great Society was a good idea or a good thing, just fundamentally that. Yep. And they raise the case that some of these folks would say that you're sort of in love with Johnson and in love with these kinds of liberal politics and are ignoring that, quote unquote, this is from the Wall Street Journal. They say, consider also the war on poverty's effects like welfare dependency. 1 in 5 Americans belong to a family receiving, in 1983, federal benefits like food stamps and Head Start. And it goes on and rattles off what arguably is actually a somewhat racist, in my view, description of some of the consequences, such as teen pregnancy rates, because they're all described as having happened among African Americans and not just among poor people. But how do you respond to that notion that maybe the Great Society really wasn't so great?
Yeah, I mean, that was an odd review. It used the book as a platform to attack liberalism. And that's not unusual when you write about the Great Society, actually. And so it's interesting to see how this becomes a means of having this other kind of debate. The book isn't meant as a love note to Lyndon Johnson or the Great Society. There are many problems with the programs. You know, I talk about how when Medicare is created, they cut a deal, Johnson and Wilbur Mills, early on, that they won't put controls on costs. They'll let the doctors and hospitals decide what's reasonable, and the government will pay it. That, right away, was a huge problem in the legislation. On civil rights, some things were left behind that were quite essential. And you can make the argument some of the domestic programs were badly conceived and didn't achieve all their goals. But I think that kind of critique is just wrong. I do think on poverty, it's just a mistake not to see in the 10 to 20 years after the passage of these programs, not just the war on poverty, food stamps, Head Start, Medicaid, it's had a really big effect on lowering rates of poverty in a way no other moment in government policy has since that time. The statistics are quite clear. The rate goes down really dramatically. And the supports that these programs continue to provide through today make the condition of poverty certainly much better than they would be without that. If we didn't have food stamps, if we didn't have Head Start, if we didn't have other programs, Medicaid, the situation would be much worse. And a lot of the problems we talk about with poverty aren't a result of the Great Society. It's either a result of things those programs weren't able to achieve, but also changes in public policy, tax policy, regulations, funding for the inner cities that have happened in the era of Ronald Reagan. So I think that critique gets it wrong. I think there's a lot of criticism to make of the Great Society, but I think sometimes they're not careful with looking at the data and looking at the evidence about what these have achieved. And it's no surprise that many conservatives today basically live with a lot of these programs and accept them. And so the story in 2010 of Tea Party Republicans protesting President Obama's health care program, which would include savings in Medicare, by saying, "Get your government hands off my Medicare," was a funny story. It was hypocritical, but it captured that generally, even conservatives who raise these complaints understand that these have been important and become really central parts of American life.
There are consequences of these sorts of legislations that go far beyond the specific things that they address.
Sure.
Social Security, one of its biggest impacts was that it meant that young people at the prime of their lives no longer had to stay back on the farm and take care of the old people that they descended from, in a time when old people were likely to starve to death or come very close to it out in the country. You couldn't leave them behind. And so because of Social Security, and then later because of Medicare, it liberated millions of people to actually pursue economic opportunities. There's an argument like that around the Affordable Care Act that I haven't really heard made very often. I don't know whether it would hold up or not, but that it ought to encourage entrepreneurialism and the ability for people to feel much more at liberty to pursue whatever they want to pursue. But it is curious that those aspects of these bills are viewed purely in this liberal democratic sort of construct, government too big or government too small. And there's a similar thing to that is striking to me, and you don't ever really address it in the book, but you offer a lot of evidence of it. You describe a number of these important segregationists of the South and how they evolve over time, but you several times you identify people as segregationists or white supremacists, but who had been very supportive of government programs to help the poor, and sometimes you say specifically poor white people. But there's this interesting history of Southern politics where until the 1960s, essentially every Southern politician of any consequence argued that the government should be deeply involved in eliminating poverty or making poverty less desperate because so many people were so desperately poor. But they are talking only about poor white people. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the 1960s and this landmark legislative period, and it's then that anti-poverty programs and pro-black people programs become conjoined, that notion that they go together. And that's also when so many white politicians of the South abandoned the whole idea of the government playing a part in all of that. Mm-hmm. But is that a fair read to how we evolved to the current politics?
Yeah, I think that's when these two issues become conflated. So even if you talk about a Southern conservative, the principal areas they were conservative were race relations and unions, which they didn't want coming into the South. But on other issues, like federal support for rural areas, rural electrification, agricultural support, poverty policy, they were often comfortable with that federal money as long as it was contained and controlled. But that changes in the mid-1960s. Some people say that the war on poverty from the start, even though it was for all Americans, the real goal was to provide yet another pillar to civil rights. This was one part of a bigger campaign to create racial justice. But certainly for many conservatives, this is when they back off from issues like fighting poverty. And you hear arguments either explicit or coded that poverty policy is about policies for African Americans. And that's very different than what it was in the 60s, or even the reality of where federal money goes since the 1960s, but that political argument certainly emerges. So one story I found, before the riots happened, Johnson sends a bill to Congress which no one thinks is going to be controversial. It's money for rat extermination in cities, which is a huge public health problem at the time. It's not a lot of money, but these are going to be grants to help combat this problem. And most people thought this is going to go through. Who wants children to be subject to being bitten by rats? And then the riots take place, and all of a sudden this inconsequential bill gets tied up in the politics of race and the politics of poverty. And conservatives attack the bill and say, look at what's happening in the riots. We can't support this. One conservative calls it the Civil Rats Act that Johnson's trying to push. And by the time the riots end, the bill is dead. And that's a small example where you could see just what you're talking about. And those two areas of policy start to blend into each other.
We also forget, I think, the impact of that sort of phenomenon on the perspectives of African Americans. Because here you have this group of people who have, in a very civil way, all through the civil rights movement for the most part, in the most polite and mannered and unprovocative way, been trying to put forth just this moral question that really was the idea that not we deserve things because there's something special about us, but that you've been providing these opportunities and these benefits to everybody else for this really long period of time. We've been deprived of it. Wouldn't it be fair for the government to do the same things for us that it does for them? And then at the very moment that finally they prevail, that suddenly this enormous part of the electorate and the political community decides, oh no, actually we shouldn't be involved in the business of helping people in those ways at all. But the impact of that on African American thinking and perspectives on American life was pretty dramatic.
And it's not just from conservatives that this happened. So the other bill I talk about is a bill for open housing. In 1966, Johnson sends this to Congress and has a lot of support among liberals. It's basically to prevent discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. And this was seen as really central to the next phase of civil rights. Martin Luther King is the person who's helping get support for this. He moves into an apartment in the slums of Chicago to bring national attention. But what the bill instantly reveals, the proposal for the bill, it gets stifled for 2 years, is that a backlash is brewing among Democrats who are liberal, not simply conservatives. So many Democrats from urban areas, from white ethnic constituencies, start to really revolt and express their displeasure at the idea that the federal government will gain the right to have a say in who you can sell a house to or who you can't sell your house to. And that's part of how the midterms of 1966 turn against liberals in a lot of areas in Illinois. And so that affects African American thinking too, to see members of their own party who had been supportive of so many programs start to back away when it dealt with issues of northern cities.
It's also interesting to me that at the beginning of this whole process, that the very first piece of legislation out of the box is this tax cut. And he gets that out of the way first before he then goes into the social legislation. But there is a message that goes with that tax cut when he's getting the first bill pushed through a committee where he makes the case that this is not going to cost anything. You know, we're going to make this big change in expansion of government, but we can cut things in other places and we can still balance the budget. We can get it down to the number that these conservatives want. And that sets, that in that one moment freezes what really has become the sort of fantasy and this curse on American politics for the last 50 years. But this idea that we can accomplish great things, our government can always do new and remarkable things, but it can always be done without actually getting more revenue from the American people.
Yes, it's true. I mean, it's important to remember this is a period when tax rates for the wealthy were over 90% and much higher. Kennedy had been pushing for a tax cut that the idea was to give workers and middle-class Americans more money. They would spend it, and it would grow the economy. And I start the section after Johnson becomes president with that bill. And he enters into this negotiation with Harry Byrd, who's the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, who's saying to him, I'll push the tax cut through, even though it will increase deficits, which bothered him, but only if you keep your budget to a relatively low figure. And Johnson does this. Liberals in his administration say, we can't do this. You can't start a great society without money. You can't cut taxes. But Johnson's saying, these are the guys who control Capitol Hill, and I'm not going to get away with much more, and I want this tax cut. So he does that. And throughout his presidency, he's always very reluctant to ask for huge amounts of federal spending. It is in some ways a great society on the cheap.
And becomes a fairly pernicious and constant element of American political life on both sides of the equation, and I think it also encourages the notion that since it is an axiom accepted by all that we should be able to do more with the same amount of money. And so then the question is, well, where does the money come from? It must be possible to make cuts. Well, we can't cut things that already do a good thing. So it must be that the government does bad things. We have to identify waste and fraud in the bad things government does and cut from there. And then that notion becomes broadly accepted that at any given moment there are huge amounts of money being wasted by the government. And I'm sure that there were, but probably not to the degree that we're often led to believe. And so we have President Reagan gives us Star Wars on the cheap as well, but we just borrow the money to do it, and the social agendas of other presidents. Again and again and again, we keep trying to to square this unsquareable thing.
That happened with the War on Poverty when he proposes it and gets it passed in 1964. He doesn't ask for a very big budget. It's minuscule at the time. His plan is to ask for more later on. By the following year, he's planning for more, but he never gets it because the politics turn against the program. So the War on Poverty, which, as I said, accomplished a lot, is always very meagerly funded.
Before we run out of time, we have to talk for a few minutes about this incredibly kind gift that was given to you by Hollywood, and that was the film Selma. And you were drawn into some of the questions around the accuracy, or both the sort of technical accuracy, but also sort of the larger subjective accuracy of the depiction of Johnson in particular.
Yeah, it's been an amazing experience, I could say. The book and the movie came out literally the same week. And I saw the movie right when it opened in New York, a little ahead of the national open. I was quite moved by the movie generally. The basic message of the film is one that resonates with the book, that a lot of the changes that took place in the 60s weren't just a product of presidents and Congress. It was a product of people taking to the streets, of people mobilizing, organizing, protesting. The marches in Selma were essential to getting Johnson to move earlier on a voting rights bill than he was ready to do. It captures the strategic skills of Martin Luther King at trying to figure out what's going on in Washington, how do I connect it to the protests, and how do I bring this all together. It isn't a good portrayal of Lyndon Johnson. It's wrong. I've said that. I don't think it gets him right. Lyndon Johnson, by 1965, is fully not just in favor of voting rights, but committed to it. He believes this is going to be a signature bill for how people remember him. The first thing he does almost after being reelected is tell Nick Katzenbach, who's going to be the Attorney General, to write up a legislation so it's ready to go. In February of 1965, 1 month before Selma, Katzenbach, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, and Everett Dirksen are having daily negotiations in Dirksen's office where they drank bourbon and smoked cigarettes. But they basically come up with a framework for a voting rights bill. And the big debate is over when to send it, not if, not how important it is. And King understood this. King and Johnson were working closely together during this period to figure out how to break through Congress. Johnson wanted to wait longer than King did. So I think the movie makes a mistake. I do fear that this is what people who don't know anything else are going to take away. He was just a president obsessed with surveillance, not really interested in voting rights. But more importantly, it missed something really fundamental to the period, that you had a president working, coordinating, thinking through the problems of a piece of legislation with the leader of a movement that was seen as radical at the time. It's quite amazing to see a social movement and the White House working together. So I feel the movie kind of missed an opportunity with that. I still tell people, see that movie. It's actually quite important. And the heart of the movie still offers viewers something really remarkable in understanding the courage it took to fight for this bill on the streets of Selma.
How important is it that films like this get things right, or how close to right they get them?
Well, I do think it's important not to go too far from historical reality. This is an era where this is the first cut of history for many people, and that's just the truth. It's a problem of how civics is taught in high schools and how much people read. So you don't want them to see movies and get things that are fundamentally wrong. A person supported one thing but is presented as not supporting it. I do think filmmakers, playwrights, television writers have freedom to play around with chronology and to tell the story in the way they want, to make drama where it might not exist. This is important. Politics is often just boring. It's conversations, it's negotiation. It's not always high moments of thrilling interaction. So that's part of what Hollywood can do. It brings it alive, makes it vivid. But I do think they need to be careful. And I think this is a case where in some ways the film got tied into something that wasn't necessary and gives an incorrect impression about not just any figure, but the President of the United States. The good thing about this, when Hollywood does this, when they create a controversy, in addition to your book coming out at the same time, is it creates a conversation about issues that are otherwise not part of the dinner table. So all of a sudden, people, including kids, are talking about, what was the relationship with the protesters in the White House? How does a bill come about? How does Washington work? And that's one of the things I think the filmmaker has actually done well. She stimulated a national conversation about issues that are relevant today.
Why is it, or at least my observation, that marches and such today mean nothing to us? They meant a lot then. So maybe the reverse of it is that question. Why did the fact that a group of black people walking down the street, or 100,000 black people showing up in Washington, D.C., or a group of veterans marching through Washington, or young people angry about the Vietnam War having such an impact on President Johnson later in the 60s, why did those events matter in a way that today they're largely irrelevant?
That's a good question. I mean, part of the answer lies in the movements. And so the movements of the 1960s were incredibly effective at coordinating what went on in Washington and what went on in the grassroots. A lot of these protests were about very specific things that I think was quite important. So Selma is about a voting rights bill that's already out there, and they want to move it through. And I think that kind of focus and coordination made the movement very powerful. You saw that on the anti-war movement and other kind of protests. At the time, you had leaders like King who were very shrewd and strategic and understood that what happened in Washington was, in the end, as important as what went on in the streets. He didn't see the two as disconnected. I think you can argue some movements, both on the left and the right, are more fragmented and disjointed and don't have a thing that they're pushing for. It's just protest. But in the end, that doesn't have a great effect on members of Congress. Part of it is about Washington. And so, if you have gerrymandered districts where a member of Congress doesn't really care what's going on in the streets somewhere else, it's not going to have as big effect. So that trend toward incumbency, which is around in the 60s but continues to accelerate, certainly dampens part of it. And then finally, the media and how it's covered. Back then, it's quite dramatic how when these protests took place, most of the media focused. It was a media where they could reach a broad part of America. So if you wanted to watch TV, you were going to see images of Selma. Today, if there's a march on the left or the right, you can watch TV and ignore what's going on in the news. You could watch on any channel, any device, and I think that fragmentation of the media often makes it harder for a movement to have that same kind of impact. Not as many people are watching. They're not paying attention. And that wasn't the case back then when there was just a much more limited number of outlets.
In the end, this book is an argument against what, or against whom, or against what idea? Is it a Master of the Senate? Is it Robert Caro's version of Lyndon Johnson? Is that what you're contesting?
I'm contesting a general approach to understanding politics that centers exclusively on the president. And the argument is that you have to understand how and when Congress changes to understand why we have great moments of political change. And the second is to say that it's not enough to have a nostalgia that Congress is better back then than it is today. It takes people to change Congress. It took a civil rights movement. It took voters in 1964 to move Congress to a place that Lyndon Johnson could exploit. So I am arguing against a general tendency in writing about American politics and how we view politics today, a constant obsession that the president is the only part of the story.
A messiah complex.
Yeah, and there was one article about the book that captured in a snappy title. Frank Bruni said, "Man of the Moment." And this is about putting the moment back into these stories and understanding why we get a moment the way it was and how that affects American politics. And no one would have agreed more with me, I think, than Lyndon Johnson, who throughout the tapes I heard was always telling people to watch out, not to have too much of expectations about what a president could do on his own. And a Johnson who understood down deep that Washington revolved around this institution on Capitol Hill, and that unless you did that, unless you got the Congress you needed, nothing was going to get done.
And so, in terms of a lesson that can be drawn, or a set of lessons, or something to hope for, whatever it might be, in terms of the remainder of this presidency and what may come in the next presidency, I know historians hate lessons, to be asked for lessons, but
Right.
what is the lesson that we can draw from your understanding of this history that has some real application either to the current presidency or the next one?
I think for this presidency, I don't have many lessons at this point because Congress is what it is, and there's going to be limits on what he could do, President Obama, outside of executive power. But there is a lesson that if people are frustrated with Congress, if people think that this Senate and House generally have become dysfunctional, there's really two avenues you have to pursue to change that. One is much more attention to midterm elections and to the congressional elections in 2016. Both Republicans who want a different kind of party and Democrats who want more power can't put all their financial chips in the presidential basket. And the second is to look more seriously at how Congress works. Look at the campaign finance system. Look at the way districts are drawn. Unless you deal with those fundamentals, we are guaranteeing we will have the same Congress in the next 2 or 3 cycles. And that's the lesson of the book, that the great change really comes when those fundamentals about the way the legislative process works are tackled, are dealt with, and are transformed.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Julian Zelizer, his book is The Fierce Urgency of Now. To learn more about this book, to send us a comment, to download a podcast of this and other episodes, or to read a transcript, visit us at millercenter.org, where American Forum is available 24 hours a day. I'm Doug Blackman. See you next time.